Welcome back everybody. Today we're doing a proposed minimum requirement of Stormgate, the StarCraft, Warcraft mixed up a game from their own developer from Blizzard. It's only in early access and the game is in a mixed review, and so far for the proposed minimum requirement is also quite vague information. Hopefully they're going to put more information when the game is really out, because the minimum requirement doesn't make much sense. You need a 6-core 2.3 GHz. I don't know which CPU is it at all. Is it Intel? AMD? The only 6-core 2.3 GHz that I know of is the 10th gen i5-10500T. T standing for terrible, because this is a terrible CPU. For the RAM we have a 16 GB of memory, this is quite standard, and for the graphics we have a GTX 1060, no AMD, and we don't know if it's the 3 GB or the 6 GB variant. So let's try to find out what they were expecting. So I'm not sure it's a proposed or a real minimum requirement, but let's jump in. So welcome to Response PC, I'm Doug, let's game on. First of all, the quick disclaimer, I've tested the game on the freshly installed Windows with the game install and MSI Afterburner. Second part is I don't have an i5-10500T weird CPU to choose to put as a minimum requirement. So I instead right away go with the i5-4460. This is a 4-core 4-thread CPU instead of a 6-core, but it runs at 3.4 if you count the boost. Obviously the 16 GB of memory, which we won't even need that much, and the GTX at 1060. I'm going to try both the 3 and the 6 GB variant, starting with the 6 GB. Obviously we're going to play at 1080p low settings. So the GTX 1060, the 6 GB variant to start with, at 1080p low settings we're averaging 115 FPS, but keep in mind that we are the first mission in the campaign. There's not a lot of unit going around, but still we're only using 4.6 GB of memory. The GPU is in the 90, but the CPU is pegged at 100%. So maybe the 6-core is a good choice, but maybe a 4-core 8-thread, because the i5-10500T is not something that you can find easily. It's not common at all. I mean, it is right now highly playable. So next mission. Same setup, but jump to medium settings. We're still averaging 87 FPS, still super highly playable. Give some break to the CPU, and now we're mid-90s for CPU utilization. For the memory we jump to 5 to 5.5 gig of memory. Again, we're not in a big 200 unit war right now, but still highly playable so far for the campaign. The VRAM of the GPU is at 3.8, so maybe the 3 GB variant is not good enough, but we're still at the medium settings. Cranking the settings to high now. We have a 74 FPS. I'm not sure what I should say. 1080p, low settings, medium settings, high settings. I know they didn't tell or specify which resolution and what settings you should use. Or normally it should be 1080p and low settings to be 60 or 30 FPS. On in even weird case, they will say 45 FPS, but we don't know. And we're quite off of everything they say for proposed minimum requirement, because even the GTX 1060 6 GB with those settings we are 96% utilization with 3.8 3.4 GB of VRAM utilization. The CPU is in the mid-90s and the RAM was still at 5.1 to 5.5. Even cranking the settings to ultra setting, the game is still highly playable. We have 63 FPS, but now the GPU is finally pegged at 100% of utilization, even though it's not using its full 6 GB of memory of VRAM, reaching as high as 4.2 GB of VRAM. The CPU have even more room now. It's go down to the high 80s of CPU utilization. For the memory, we're still in the 5 GB to 6 GB of memory. So 16 GB so far is too high, but we didn't reach hundreds of units yet. So let's keep it at that for now. Dropping the GTX at 1060 6 GB variant for the GTX at 1060 3 GB variant. At 1080p, I kept ultra settings just because it was still quite high with the 6 GB variant, and we barely passed the 4 GB of VRAM. So the 3 GB VRAM may be able to reach the 60 or 30 FPS, whatever the goal target was for this game. And even at ultra settings, we have an average of 63 FPS. Ultra settings, I repeat, ultra settings, 63 FPS. The VRAM is at 2.7. The GPU utilization is at 98 to 100%. The CPU is in the mid-90s to high 80s. And for the RAM, we are at 4.9 to 5 GB of memory. And right now, we're almost at 100 units, plus the allies, plus the enemies. So yes, it's not hundreds of hundreds, but still give quite an idea of how it would perform. And even though I find the CPU utilization is quite high, it's still playable and I have barely any stutter. And depending where you are and what's happening on the map, I've been as low as 44 and as high as 96 FPS. And since it's a DX11 game, it would be playable on really old hardware and old GPU. Probably want to copy StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3 to be able to reach the maximum player base by having the maximum of player can play with their old hardware and new. And that's it for this proposed minimum requirement. Not sure if it should be a real propose, just call it minimum requirement. Anyway, see you in the next one and don't forget to subscribe.